important to acknowledge the kind of practitioners and the people with lived experience who've been part of your life. I have learned from being around people who were generous of their time, who were generous in terms of trusting me when there are a whole range of reasons not to trust other people. I've been fortunate enough to benefit from a number of mentors, and I'm still fortunate to benefit from a number of people who inspire me. Jenny actually being one of them. She is an ex-student of mine, but like all really good ex-students, has happily outgrown her tutor, and it's not my fault what she forgot. Does that make sense? I'll deny any responsibility. The good bits are mine, the bad bits are come from, hanging around with other people in terms of where we are. It's also important to maybe mention some of my academic inspiration. That might sound odd. But one of my real sources of inspiration is a guy called Preltensky, who's a community psychologist. My background is in mental health and learning disability nursing, then psychology and psychotherapy. And Preltensky is an interesting character because he's a community psychologist. And one of his absolute arguments was, whatever we do, it has to have this thing called psychopolitical validity. It's not good enough for us to wait down the line and pick people up who've been made sick by our society, by the misogyny of our society. We have a duty to go upstream. Because if we don't, we're complicit in this and we're profiting by it. So whatever we do, it has to have this thing called psychopolitical validity. We need to be committed to making a difference. We need to keep committed to improving the health of our community and not just the health of the individual people we work with. Hence the kind of focus of my session, which is a little bit of kind of what happened to you that shouldn't have, a little bit of what didn't happen for you which should have, because making sense of your journey, which is unique to you, and we're all workers in progress, means asking both those questions. And particularly in Scotland, and particularly in the west of Scotland, we need to ask whatever the hell happened to your community. Because if we don't think about deindustrialisation as an intergenerational trauma, then we don't understand your community's journey and we don't understand individuals' journey. So we need to be able to ask all those three questions. So in order to do that, I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. Now, some of this you may have come across before. And what you don't want to happen is when you press the button, there's nothing to happen. So what we're going to do is start from a little bit about, this sounds odd, but we're going to think about narratives in terms of dynamics. If you think historically about conventional explanations for distress, people are struggling, and that struggle presents in a whole variety of ways, in terms of addiction, in terms of low mood, in terms of relationships. Historically, the approach we've used as a society to make sense of that is that lens on the left. People are mad, bad, or sad. Now, we need strategies to make sense of people's behaviour. We need strategies in order to guide our judgments in relation to people's behaviour. And we are all, unfortunately, both individually and collectively, prone to judgment. It's kind of what we do. And most of the time, unfortunately, this is unconscious. We're not aware of our attributional process and not aware of how it plays out. And what that tends to lead us to, individually and collectively, is into that box on the right. So if the individual is bad, then we seek ways to punish them. If the individual is mad, then depending on the dominant narrative, we seek ways of treating, of fixing that condition using that medical model of looking for the right condition. If the person is sad, then we look to rescue that individual, but not necessarily in a way that empowers the individual or values their experience or recognises their journey. So both of those frames are problematic. We need, therefore, a different frame. And what trauma-informed practice does is gives us a different frame, a profoundly different frame, and a frame in some ways which is challenging for our society. Because as a society, we are very prone, for example, to victim blaming. We're very prone to not recognising the impact on the individual. We're prone to making judgments, not you individually, but collectively. So we're going to do something different. And what trauma-informed practice does, it says if we need to make sense of people's distress, we need to understand their journey. We need to understand their story and their understanding of their story, because only by responding to that and only by responding and privileging that information can we work with the person. Because the person is not just a diagnosis, they're not just what happened to them, they're how they made sense of that, they're how they're making sense of that, they're how their judgments and other people's judgments have impacted upon them. So I need to understand your journey in terms of trauma. I need to understand your journey in terms of your learned behaviour, because we learn patterns of response that can become embedded in our behavioural repertoire, some of which, indeed many of which, are coping strategies for trauma. And we need to understand your history of relationships, because you are not an individual isolated in the world. You are nested in a whole network of relationships. And these relationships can be critical to your health. They can be healthy relationships, sometimes they can be unhealthy relationships, but human beings are born with the need for connection, without exception. Historically, and I trained originally as a learning disability nurse way back in the 1970s, because I'm very old, we had a belief that people with autism didn't have connections. That turned out to be complete balderdash. 80% of people with autism show significant attachment. So we need to suspend belief or suspend disbelief and think about attachments that matter. We also need to think about attachment histories as being a source of trauma, where attachment histories are problematic, because in understanding your journey, what happened to you that should not have in terms of trauma, what happened to you that should have in terms of a history of secure, continuous, stable attachments with an attuned, empathic, compassionate adult, sometimes didn't, for a whole variety of reasons. And then we need to think about what do your responses look like and where are you in terms of your journey. So that's our point of departure. Does that sound okay? Actually, even if you didn't say okay, that's going to be your point of departure, because I can't change the script at this point in time. We're going to do some of this quite quickly in terms of where we are. So again, point of departure. When we talk about trauma, and adversity and trauma are not the same thing. Adversity and trauma are two distinct things, but when we talk about adversity, the reality is adversity is common. Yep, it's remarkably common. All right, do you want me to use the microphone? Yeah, no, you're fine. Okay. Is that better, guys, at the back? I can just be loud, actually. It's probably just as effective in terms of dynamic. It works better if it's turned. Does it work better if it's turned on? Yeah, okay, right. So in terms of where we are, again, just a point of departure. If we want to address issues around physical health, then we need to think about trauma. If we want to address issues around, for example, imprisonment and addiction, we need to think about trauma. If we want to think around issues around diet and obesity, we need to think about trauma. So when we think about adversity, we need to recognize both the prevalence of adversity and the significance of adversity. What we also need to realize is that adversity is not experienced equally. When we look at studies into adversity, and even if you look back at the studies into adverse childhood experiences, adverse experiences are not experienced equally. There is a disparity. And one of the things we know from multiple other studies, including studies now done in Glasgow, is adversity clusters. So we have postcode areas in Glasgow where higher levels of adversity are significantly more common. So your experience is not representative of the community's experience. Your experience is not representative of society. Our experience differs. And what we find is that in some instances, we get real clusters of adversity, and that impact is significant. One of the critiques of the original Adverse Childhood Experience study, and you will be really familiar with this, is it didn't pick up in poverty. Now, there's a whole variety of reasons why that study didn't pick up in poverty, because it was a study of people in America who had health insurance. Guess what? People in real poverty in America don't have health insurance. So it could not include that study. But what we know is, in terms of impact, poverty is by far the biggest single form of adversity in terms of its impact on people's mental health, on people's physical health, and people's life expectancy. There's a really good Welsh study that said if you really want to boil down the impact of adversity and model the impact of different forms of adversity, two biggies emerge. And it's interesting that two biggies emerge. One is poverty, the other is maternal alcoholism. If you want to predict a child's life outcome. Now, that's not about mother blaming, and these two factors are not connected, but it is about recognizing the interconnection between those two. So we know about adversity. You guys know adversity extremely well. And when we think about adversity, adversity is not something that happens to other people. For some of the people in this room, adversity is something that will have impacted upon them. And we need to be sensitive to that dynamic. Adversity is not just individual, however. As we touched upon, adversity is collective. This is a classic slide. You'll have seen it lots of times before. If you haven't, what it reminds us is the impact of your adversity intrafamilially is magnified if there's also significant levels of adversity in your community. And we've had major social policy changes which have led to the concentration of adversity in smaller geographical areas. From a health perspective, that's a really dumb thing to do, but our social policy and our politicians don't necessarily think about the long-term impact, for example, of selling off social housing and all that goes along with that in terms of concentration and deprivation. So in making sense of your experience, we need to make sense of your community's experience, because you and your community are intertwined. So again, mindful that you will have covered ACEs, and it's also useful though to reflect on how do ACEs work. So the notion in terms of how ACEs work is fairly simple. The adverse childhood experience, or the cluster of adverse childhood experiences. And I was talking to Peter before this session started. I worked in mental health. I used to manage secure services in mental health. I managed at one point secure services in residential childcare. Studied in Wales and kids entering secure residential childcare. None of these kids had an ACE score lower than 9. Adversity hurts. Adversity causes harm. Not at an individual level, but at a collective level. So what we see is a pattern of adverse childhood experiences which lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, and we're going to look at development after a brief pause. It affects social, emotional, and cognitive development, which in turn leads to adoption of health risk behaviours. So I worked, for example, in residential childcare, kids who are self-medicating with alcohol at 12 to deal with their trauma symptoms. These were using health risk behaviours to manage symptomatic behaviour. That in turn, of course, exposed them to other risks. Because if you're a 12-year-old girl drinking behind the co-op and drinking a bottle of Buckfast, you're putting yourself at risk of a whole other history in terms of dynamics of trauma. So we deal with a dynamic where trauma clusters in people's lives. That in turn impacts potential. It impacts, for example, the ability to focus at school. If you cannot regulate your emotions, if you cannot achieve that balanced dynamic in terms of where we are, being able to focus, being able to remember. If you're stuck in panic mode, if you're stuck in DEFCON 3, the ability even to read the text in front of you can be tricky. So this becomes a cascade working its way across. An important point, and a point that got lost in some of the original work done around ACEs in Scotland, is ACEs are a lousy predictor at an individual level. So ACEs can predict at a group level that within this group, these individuals are likely over time are more likely to develop this health issue. They are absolutely useless at predicting your individual score, because I talked about those kids with ACE scores of 9 in secure childcare. We have a significant number of people with ACE scores of 9 who are employed, who are parents, who are grandparents, who are working in the therapeutic industry, who are working in mental health. They're not a good predictor individually. They tell us what happened to you. They don't tell us actually about your recovery. They don't tell us about your post-traumatic growth. They don't tell us your story. And part of what happened to you in your childhood is one part of your story. How you coped, the other relationships you formed, your recovery journey isn't necessarily part of that story. What we see in terms of adversity, statistically at group level, is significant increases in early morbidity. So if you look at Glasgow, and I'm going to talk about Glasgow for an example, your postcode predicts your life expectancy in Glasgow. Your postcode in the west of Scotland predicts your life expectancy. So which postcodes in Glasgow do you think you are likely to live longest? Yes. Where's the Mulgai, strangely enough? Which postcodes do you think you're likely to live least? Yeah. Yep. Okay, so from a social justice lens, that doesn't work. We need to fix that, which means to look back at the root causes of what's going on. Because historically, we've individualized that and said people are making bad decisions. They're eating bad food. They're not taking enough exercise. That lens has not transformed the health of those communities. We need a different lens and a different narrative, hence the lens in terms of trauma-informed practice, because what it does is it takes us back to root causes. It takes us back to poverty, for example. So what do we do? Some of you will have heard Nadine Burke, and if you haven't, then you should. Now, this may not work in terms of sound. We'll see what happens. Or it just may not work at all. Okay. Okay, that's always encouraging. Actually, I'm better than Nadine Burke anyway. Actually, whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, she's absolutely lovely. Oh, she's working. Okay.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a pathogen chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night.
What happens when the bear comes home every night? What happens when your place of safety, your relationship of safety, your sense of nurture is your unsafe place? So working with kids, one of the issues we would come across is kids would say the only safe place they experienced was school. The only connected, attuned adult they encountered was at school. They went home to trauma. They went home to fear. They went home to a level of unpredictability because dad hit them when he was drunk, and he was drunk every night. He didn't hit them every night, but they lived with the possibility of being hit every night. Can you see the level of fear? But epidemiologists will talk about allostatic load, that load on your system, that stress load across the system. If your stress system is activated, we see increased risk of autoimmune disease, we see increased risk of MS, we see a whole range of diseases that relate back to your allostatic load across the lifespan. So even if you don't smoke too much, even if you don't drink too much, even if you exercise, there's still a risk that comes from that allostatic load. Now be mindful though, of my earlier point, this is not about the prediction of your health status and your health risk. These are averages taken across the population, but they are really significant. When we think about trauma though, and think about childhood trauma, as Nadine spoke about powerfully, and if you ever have an opportunity to meet her at conferences, I was very fortunate to be introduced to her by a mutual friend, Sandra Bloom, and it turns out she drinks tequila. if you get an opportunity, an expensive Mexican tequila brand, if you get the opportunity to meet her. Terms of dynamics, we see adverse child experiences, but what we need to do is remember generational and historical trauma. Because when we talk about trauma and the impact of trauma, we're not just talking about what happened to you, we're often dealing about parents who themselves have experienced trauma. And there's now a new science in terms of epigenetics. Historically, when Peter and I learned about genetics, basically the genes were the things which you inherited, and these things would then find their expression. And they could be influenced by the environment. So, for example, the amount of protein in your environment might determine the height you gained. Yes, so there was an interaction between your gene and the expression of that gene. The epigenetics now suggests that actually what happened to you or what happened to your mother when she was in the womb can leave a long-lasting impact which is transmitted between generations. That it's not just about what happened to you, it's what happened to your parents, it's what happened to your grandparents in terms of dynamic, because we need to understand that dynamic in terms of where we are. We also need to understand the dynamic and the interplay between trauma and thinking about race and thinking about ethnicity and thinking about gender, because gender impacts your risk of trauma. I was talking to Eve about male violence. We have a significant problem of male violence, for example, in the UK. We have a particular problem of male violence in Scotland. If you look at lifetime prevalence rates of PTSD between men and women in Scotland, they're different. They're different because of male violence. They're different because of males choosing to act in ways that make women feel unsafe. I'm a male. I've never had to phone a friend on my way home. That's not true. I have occasionally phoned a friend drunkenly on my way home, but it wasn't a safety issue. It was probably trying and failing to explain a joke that somebody had told to me in the pub. Yeah. But I haven't had to think about my journey home. My experience as a man is different from that experience. What you're talking about there, in some respects, are the microaggressions that lead to people feeling unsafe. These little dynamics in terms of trauma, which impact on people's feeling of safety, which go back to allostatic load in terms of dynamics. So trauma is mediated by gender, it's mediated by income, it's mediated by class, it's mediated by race, and how individuals experience it is therefore unique. But adversity, as we touched on, is not trauma. And let me give you an example, because the event is not trauma, it's how you experience the event. So I went to school in the east of Scotland, and I went to a school which only allowed you to play rugby because football was for plebs. I quote the PE teacher. You know, the classic dynamic in Glasgow, you're asked what school you went to figure out your religion. In Edinburgh, you're asked your school to figure out your class. My mother was aspirational. Does that make sense in terms of dynamics? I played rugby and had my nose broken 3 times playing rugby. None of them were traumatic, usually because I started it. Does that make sense? So not at all. Nothing at all. But for somebody else who had their nose broken, context, reaction determines the event, determines the significant event, determines the long-lasting events. I will often describe how much I love my wife, and I do deeply, but one of the things I say in relation to demonstrating my proof of my relationship is Liz wanted me to get my nose fixed for the photos, and you're now looking at my nose, which makes me self-conscious. They did a fairly good job in terms of where. In order to fix it, because I'd had it broken 3 times, they had to break it 3 times again to make it straight. Yes. That was really sore. It was much more painful than having it broken the first time. And I was managing a residential childcare unit. So you imagine I've had my nose broken 3 times. My face has kind of reacted to this. And I went into residential childcare. Now, thinking about life history, what do you think the first question they asked was? I quote, "Who the fuck did that to you?" And did you get them back? Because that was their worldview. You don't take that. You make sure you hurt them worse. That was absolutely the worldview. And I explained a very expensive surgeon had fixed my nose. However, I have to confess also the way in which we fixed my nose was not what I expected. My background is not in plastic surgery. I'm not a general nurse. I have a vague understanding. I expected them to do something incredibly sophisticated. Instead, they gave me a local anaesthetic. They put a steel rule down one side of my nose and they hit it with a big rubber hammer. Yeah, the squidgy noise was not comfortable, and my apologies for trauma. It wasn't traumatic, fortunately, in terms of dynamic. But our experiences are unique and different. It's not the event, it's the context in terms of the event that can make an enormous difference. It's the reaction of the individual over time to that experience that makes a difference. When we talk about trauma then, and we start talking about trauma, there's a debate. And I'm mindful of talking about trauma and the sensitivities involving trauma. And we can use an example with care with you, because the example involves alcohol, and I'm mindful of the sensitivities of alcohol in people's lives. I'm also mindful this is the west of Scotland, so of course you guys drink. Not that I'm engaging in any stereotyping in any way at all. Would that be fair? We don't drink in the east of Scotland at all. An occasional sherry on a Friday night. Okay, so let's think about trauma and one of the symptoms of trauma, and actually one of the symptoms of PTSD, which is avoidance. So many of you at some point in your career with alcohol got so ill after drinking one form of alcohol that you've avoided it ever since. Yes, some rueful faces there in terms of dynamics. It's always interesting in terms of age to ask people what it was, because it seems to vary depending on people's early experience. What was it by any chance? Perno. Oh. Yes.
Was it with blackcurrant, Jackie? It was the same with me.
I was just going to say it would be Perno and blackcurrant, because in particular, any other starters for 10? Aftershock. Now, actually, there's a lovely dynamic in terms of trauma memory, because each of your colleagues, when they recounted that, actually demonstrated a physiological reaction. Their faces changed. Because in terms of memory for trauma is an interesting phenomenon in terms of how it's remembered. The hippocampus remembers, the cortex remembers, the amygdala remembers, and because these are connected by the vagus nerve, your stomach remembers. So when you remember that, you had a physiological reaction right down to your gut that went, ugh, don't do that again. If I waved Perno under your nose, there's a fabulous visceral reaction there. Yeah, exactly. Now, the reason that wouldn't get you a diagnosis of PTSD is your avoidance of that particular form of alcohol has not significantly interfered with your quality of life. You were able to manage that avoidance. But think about, for example, male sweat as a trigger. Think about aftershave as a trigger. Think about loud, raised male voices as a trigger. How easy would it be to avoid those? How easily could you be triggered? So for some of us, fortunately, those trauma memories can be contained, they can be managed, they can be isolated, we can avoid. For others, they are continually, repeatedly, regularly triggered, often below their level of consciousness awareness. So what we're seeing is that reaction to threat, which is embedded in our physiology, and that can become embedded in a pattern of behavior. But what we need to remember, what we're seeing is not abnormal. A reaction to fear is a reaction to fear. A reaction to threat is a reaction to threat. Your amygdala remembers you nearly killing yourself with aftershock, because from an evolutionary perspective, that was your amygdala's job. Its job was to alert you the next time you came across something the same or similar. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem in this instance is that response becomes maladaptive. And the individual might then develop maladaptive coping responses in relation to it. So PTSD is this notion of single episode trauma, and single episode trauma can be profoundly traumatic and life-altering. I worked with an individual who had been involved in the gym at Dunblane in that tragic shooting, providing first aid in the immediate aftermath of it. None of his children were hurt, but at the time he did not know that, and he was providing first aid in a situation where he believed his own children might be amongst those wounded. Something I find difficult to talk about and to think about. He developed really profound reactions to that. He developed issues around alcohol. His relationship broke down. He had to move out with the community. Anytime around the Dunblane disaster, he goes abroad. His major traumatic symptoms were nightmares. His nightmares have come and gone. His symptoms are sometimes in abeyance, and they sometimes come back. Because the way in which symptoms work for trauma is sometimes they're constant, sometimes they can be delayed, sometimes they can be transient. They can come and go. Under stress, when he's struggling, his symptoms come back, and his nightmares have made it almost impossible for him to work. Because if you don't sleep, it's very difficult to manage a routine. He is consumed by guilt because I still see him infrequently, but I still see him at his request. His guilt is about his inability to parent his children. He believes that the trauma stole his opportunity to be a parent to his children. So trauma echoes down generations. It's not a single generation, it's multiple generations. When we're talking about trauma, though, we are increasingly interested in something called complex trauma, and complex trauma is a relatively recent frame in terms of understanding what happened to people. Because the notion of PTSD is, in some respects, and my colleague in Dunblane, and I would call him a colleague because I've co-delivered training with him. He was in a safe community. Dunblane is probably statistically one of the safest communities in the United Kingdom. He was in a safe job. He was in a safe relationship. He came from a safe family. What he was exposed to was a situation that most of us would find overwhelming. It was beyond normal experience. His reaction in terms of developing symptomology, therefore, was normal and ordinary. The persistence of his was not, but he came from a safe place. So for most individuals in terms of PTSD, they start in a safe place. They're then exposed to an event or series of events which overwhelm their coping strategies internally and externally, and then they struggle to regain that sense of felt safety, but they start from a safe place. In complex PTSD, what we imagine is a scenario where the individual does not start from a safe place, where home is not safe, relationships are not safe, community is not safe. And then they're continually exposed to overwhelming experiences, often by the people whose job was to make them feel safe. So the impacts of complex trauma are much more significant, are much more profound, are much more long-lasting, and are much more persistent in terms of dynamics. And we'll look at that in terms of how it plays out. So we're not going to do a lot of diagnosis, but it is just important for you to think about and recognize that there are differences between PTSD and differences in the collective trauma, because what we see are a lot of individuals knocking about one diagnosed PTSD, and there's a lot of undiagnosed PTSD. But we also see an awful lot of people knocking about what undiagnosed complex PTSD, who are being treated for depression, who are being treated for the addiction issues they've developed as a means of coping with their continual level of distress, who ran through a whole gamut of different diagnoses and have often ended up with a diagnosis of personality disorder because they didn't get better. They didn't get better because we did not create the conditions for that individual to recover. We didn't create the relationships where that individual could learn to feel safe. We didn't create the relationships and the dynamic where we could empower that individual and create a space where they could reflect on their health. We didn't do what this service and the recovery service do. And what that means is conventional mental health has often failed both those groups significantly, both in terms of diagnosis and also providing routes to recovery which are meaningful and that actually work over the longer term. We need a different model. I'm off to Australia on Sunday, sadly for work as opposed to for recreation. And I used this slide in Australia a couple of years ago in Brisbane, and it's designed to kind of illustrate trauma, so bear with me. If you have been fortunate, safe place, safe relationships, connections, secure attachments, what children will do when they go to the bath, because connections are their sense of safety, is they'll take a toy with them to the bath. Psychoanalysts like myself will talk about transactional analysis. They'll maintain a relationship, and that's a stable relationship. So when they go to playgroup for the first time, they'll take a toy with them, or they'll take a toy with them. My daughter had a little tiger called Roger, who I think about 10 years ago we found and discovered she had a label on her, says she was called Tina. But she was Roger, and I have no idea why that toy was selected or where that toy came from. But if you have that history of connections, then you take the duck for companionship, you take the duck for safety, you take the duck for. That's your world view. Because your world view is about safety, and then safety is embedded in connections. If your worldview is a consequence of trauma, if your worldview is a consequence of adversity, is the world is not safe, the world is full of sharks, then you're constantly testing the world for sharks. You're operating on the assumption that the world is full of sharks. Your level of arousal is about there's a bear round the next corner. Using this example in Brisbane, of course, they pointed out they have real sharks in Brisbane as opposed to my imaginary sharks in Brisbane. And people do get eaten by sharks in Brisbane. So there are sharks, and it is important to be sensitive to sharks. But you need to allow for the possibility of real connection. Because what trauma does, or trauma can do, is shapes your worldview. And as a psychoanalyst and a psychotherapist, I have a real interest in worldviews and how they shape people's expectations. The notion of a worldview is not new. It goes back to some work done by German psychoanalysts in the 30s. And those of you who've come across cognitive behavioral psychotherapy and focus on core schemas will be familiar with worldview. The notion is this is a map embedded right back in terms of your early programming into a set of expectations around the world. This bit of work is adapted from Samsud and some of the really early work around trauma-informed practice. And what it says is what we see, and these are generalizations, is if you grow up believing the world is dangerous, then you're constantly going to be alert for danger. Your default assumption is going to be she means me harm, because your relationships have been unsafe, they've been exploitative, they've been transactional. So that's your template for relationships, that's your worldview, and it will play out. If your worldview is people can never be trusted because the people in your life have not been trustworthy, then that will impact upon how you react to others. That will impact upon your life experience in terms of dynamics. If your worldview is life is unpredictable and it's not under my control, then when we come to think about and engage with you in terms of making changes to your health behaviour, then that becomes much harder because your locus of control is external. Things happened to you. You did not feel in control. If your worldview about the future is you cannot control it, now if you're stuck on DEFCON 3, if you're tipped into fight or flight, or stuck in fight-flight, then the world does not feel under control. In managing a residential childcare unit for kids, we had a whole dynamic in terms of debrief with kids. And the debriefing at the time wasn't done. And when we started to do it, we ran into a big issue. Because when we started talking to kids and say, okay, you were playing pool, some kind of altercation happened, and then you tried to headbutt the guy and then stamp on him. You know, let's step back a bit and think about it. Power, control, status, shame. Actually, a lot of our kids find it almost impossible to engage with that process because what had happened is under relatively low levels of stress, they tipped into complete fight-flight. They weren't choosing reactions. They weren't actually making choices. They were just reacting. So when we were trying to do a debrief, and in the debrief we were trying to talk to the cortex, the problem is under relatively low levels of stress with these kids, it wasn't the cortex making the decision. The decision maker was absent from the room, and in actual fact what we needed to think about is how did we engage with the processes here? How did we cook the root causes in terms of avoiding that kid tipping into fight-flight? And all of that was back to trauma-informed practice and trying to enable that individual to gain some kind of reflective capacity. You live without being aware of it in a world of probabilistic reality. You make almost no decision without thinking about the consequences. And that's a good thing. It's hard to be employed in our society without the ability to exercise probabilistic reasoning. And let me give you an example. How many of you at some point have thought about saying something angry to your boss in an employment context? How many of you have you ever shouted at your boss in an employment context? Okay. How many of you have had a bite your tongue with your employer in an employment context? Yes. Yes. So, to be successful, you need under stress to be able to recognize the emotion, think about the impact of those thoughts, choose your response carefully based on an estimate, literally a statistical estimate of what is likely to happen if I do X. If you can't do those tasks, then you're unemployable. If you can't do those tasks, then you're going to struggle in a whole series of dynamics. And the problem is trauma makes it much harder for that ability to develop those skills which you need to be successful in our society. And they are skills. They're not aspects of personality, they're skills. They're skills you develop where the skills are scaffolded if you are extraordinarily fortunate to have the right circumstances in terms of family and background. We are privileged if we've had that opportunity. If you are continually exposed to narratives around you're a failure, you cannot succeed, you're ashamed. If we keep punishing kids who fail or adults who fail, all we're doing is embedding a narrative of you're a failure, you're a blame, you're a fuck up. That moves the dial not one whit. It does not engage with the support and the strategies and the relationships and the time that individual needs in order to reflect, in order to develop the skills they need. And what we see are lots of anger and lots of rage, because these individuals often develop an embedded sense of shame. And that shame could go off in a whole range of different ways in a deeply toxic dynamic. Views about self are here in terms of, these are generalizations, so they're not about individuals. But when we're engaging in terms of trying to support, it can be a really interesting exercise to get people to sit down and actually reflect on their own worldview. It's hard to draw out your own worldview because it's so embedded in terms of your psyche, it's so embedded in terms of your dynamic. I came across an example the other day, however, which hurt me physically, oddly enough. I grew up on a farm. My dad was a farmer and a very self-reliant man, very decent individual whom I loved dearly, but he hated spending money. He's from Fife and he's a farmer. Can you see the narrative? Spending money to him was deeply painful. And he also hated getting somebody else to do something he could do himself. He says that self-reliance was part of his culture. And I've inherited, unfortunately, a bit of that. And I was putting up some fence posts recently and was using a petrol auger, which is basically a very big drill about this size with a big petrol engine on top of it. I'm 67 with a dodgy back. Do you think that was a good idea? No, I've twisted my back, I've got sciatica running down my left leg, and so far I've spent more on fees to the osteopath than it would have paid me to get somebody younger and fitter to do it myself. I can recognise the pattern, I can recognise the worldview, but I can only recognise it after a painful reality involving both physical pain and pain to my wallet, because I have inherited that bit of my father's worldview. But if you can enable individuals to reflect on their worldview, if over time you can get individuals to get a little bit of insight, then you empower individuals to start to think about, can I change that? Can I test those hypotheses? And one of the things we do in any kind of therapeutic relationship is we create a safe space. And we demonstrate that we are to be trusted. We consistently demonstrate that we can be trusted. We consistently demonstrate that we can be compassionate and we will not judge. We consistently demonstrate that we have faith in that individual's road to redemption and their route to redemption, and we want to be part of that journey with them. And it's an extraordinary privilege to be along on that journey in terms of where you are. Antidepressants don't change your worldview. Why? Because they don't change your worldview. They don't change the script you have buried inside your head. We need to unpick that and enable individuals to reflect and think about it. If we're thinking about it in terms of population health, Nadine mentioned population health. The impact of ACEs on population health is enormous. Some of you will be familiar with the Glasgow effect. Have you come across the Glasgow effect in terms of population health? Now, the Glasgow effect has been something of a mystery to public health practitioners, and I'm not a public health practitioner, because even when we look at poverty, even when we look at a whole variety of other variables, even when we look at weather and sunshine and diet, the health of certain chunks of Glasgow is worse than it should be. And what eventually has emerged is this cluster in terms of trauma. And there have been a number of studies looking at the impact of deindustrialisation in Glasgow. What happened over the last 20, 30 years? What happened over the last 40 or 50 years in those particular communities that have led to their health being as bad as it was? And we now have a number of case studies looking at deindustrialisation in the west of Scotland, which compare what happened in the west of Scotland to what happened in Detroit. Because what you had was massive, rapid, large-scale unemployment, massive, large-scale economic flight, massive, large-scale social flight, because people with qualifications left. So you had an enormous disruptive influence, and that impact in terms of plays out is significant. You can't separate the health of Glasgow from the health of the community. You can't separate these two things. But if, for example, we talk about mental health conditions, my background is in mental health, who ends up spending significant periods of time in the hospital? It turns out people with higher levels of adversity. If we look at cancer statistics, we could, if we were able to reduce adversity in our community, make a significant difference to cancer statistics in terms of where we are. We could make a significant difference in terms of cardiovascular disease. We could make a significant difference in terms of drinking and abusive drinking, unhealthy drinking patterns, particularly binge drinking. We can make a difference in terms of anxiety. So thinking about trauma is not just thinking about a message for us in our practice. It's how do we convey this message to GPs? How do we convey this message to primary school teachers? When they're seeing a child who's struggling to engage with a class, how do we convey a message that says, don't look for that diagnosis of ADHD, look to the child's background, look to the child's history, look to what's happening for that family, look at what has happened to that family.
The government had been collecting data that showed there had been these huge class differences in life expectancy, and people didn't really believe the data. Even people working in important positions in the health service didn't know whether death rates were highest at the top or the bottom.
From cocaine to ketamine to capitalistic principle, try to put my smile back on his face, but I couldn't get it, so I said a tearful goodbye to all but one of my principles and started conversing with the flow that led me to the slippery road. I wasn't always this way. I guess it started on the day they called the curtains on her casket and she flew away and left me here grounded, cuddling on the truest pain. My biggest ambition in life, try to get through a day. My mum was 36 when she died. If I keep drinking, that's me. Imagine that, being dead at 36, for fuck's sake. All of the things that I need to do to try and lengthen my life, which is already cut short because I was born in Pollock. If I make it to 70, I'll be lucky, and that's if I eat salad every day.
Now, of course, because of a growing body of research, people know that unemployment and poverty have health consequences. Instead of the former idea that it was businessman stress that led to the worst health problems.
A lot of health problems, everything from high blood pressure to AIDS to hepatitis and all different kinds of diseases around here. Any day above ground is a good day. That's what I've been told. Actually, it's what I know. You know, if you can live to see it. My daughter's father passed on the 23rd of last year. So that kind of hurt me a little bit. Back to being a single mother. He died of liver cancer. Yeah, it was really sad. But it's a good thing. You know, I know he in a better place. He suffered for a while, quite some time. So, yeah, I do. We was together 14 years, long time. Yeah.
In Glasgow, men living in the poorest part have a life expectancy of 54. In India, 3/4 of the population live on $2 a day or less. No one in Glasgow lives on $2 a day or less. And yet men in the poorest part of Glasgow have life expectancy that's 8 years shorter than the average in India. And I thought, aha, that's it. That's going to explain it. Being relatively disadvantaged has profound consequences which determine high rates of suicide, violent deaths, alcohol, heart disease.
Alcohol gave me what I thought was confidence. So it's that core belief that you're worth something that I'm missing. It was a painkiller for your spirit, really.
I'm not sure President Trump would like that, but that's a whole other story. There's actually a very good Glasgow study, a very recent Glasgow study a couple of years back, which actually explains the dynamics and looks at the very specific impacts of it. I'll send a link of kind of background reading and bits of references through to Peter, and he can distribute them as you wish in terms of bits and pieces. But what that does is talks about the very specific issues. Nadine talked, for example, about 67% of people having more than one ACE. Actually, Scottish data overall is slightly less than that. We probably have about 51%. But what we have are more concentrated deprivation in terms of ACE, in terms of how it comes out. Okay, how do you feel? How do you feel? Name an emotion for me. How do you feel at this point in time? Okay. Yeah, we've taken a bit of a deep dive. We've looked at a particular issue. We've created a sense of we have a different narrative. We can change the story. You're part of this narrative and changing the story. The work you're doing is creating a different narrative in these communities every day. You're enabling individuals to reflect on what happened to them. You're empowering those individuals in terms of what's going on. You're giving them the tools and the skills and the knowledge to make the changes in their lives in terms of where we are. So the notion here is what you do matter. You matter in terms of where we are. But we need to be mindful of the challenges that go along with adopting a trauma-informed lens. One of the challenges we have, and we were talking about it in terms of something called the it's an interesting phrase in terms of how it's used. We talk about a triad and a narcissistic triad. And the suggestion is that psychotherapists and psychoanalysts are particularly prone to it, something I would dispute. But the notion of the narcissistic triad is, I can end up in I've now got the knowledge. I know this, yes. I need to communicate that knowledge. I need to spread this mission to people. I need to give people insight into what's happening to them. And I can rescue them from the situation they're in. So I am all-knowing. I can help anybody. And that people not only should accept my wisdom and my knowledge, they should love me for it. That's not how the world is. When we seek to provide support, there are lots of people who will not trust us and have good reason not to trust anybody. They will not trust agencies or inequalities of power. These inequalities of power are the trigger. These inequalities of power are a core element of their traumatic experience. The individuals who will continually test our safety, repeatedly and repeatedly test our safety. The individuals who want to be helped, but they don't want to be helped now, they don't want to be helped by you, they don't want to be helped in that way. What that means is this job is full of joys and it's also full of frustrations. Winnicott, who again is one of my heroes in terms of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and actually argued it's much more simple. It's about love and affection and safety. Also said something really quite profound. He said at times you will not only dislike the people you're trying to support, he said at times you will hate the people you're trying to support. And that's a really big, ugly word. He said, but you need to be fully present to your frustrations and your anger and your feelings of helplessness. And acknowledge where those lead in terms of behaviour, and through supervision allow those to be normalised, allow those to be held. Because we all have a dark side. God bless us, we all have a dark side. Freud famously said those who are drawn to help are those who actually have some point the largest dark side or the deepest dark side, which is something always to reflect upon. What draws us to this work in terms of what we're trying to do. But this work is not easy. That pause, that stop, that reflect, creating a space in your day-to-day routine, both individually and collectively and professionally as a team, is extraordinarily important. I'm a director of a number of not-for-profits, and in one of the not-for-profits I work, we engage annually in a pause week. We stop work. We use the entire week to reflect upon who we are, where we are, what is working, what is not working, how do we feel about the work, how do we feel about each other, how do we feel about the team, because we see that as being central to maintaining our health going forward. Because we talk about trauma affects not just individuals, it affects teams and organisations. Okay, so pause, stop, reflect, breathe, and you got a fabulous example of a breathing exercise earlier. Do you want to stand up for me and turn round? Because you've been sitting down a long time, you've been listening to somebody talk around. Stand up and turn round. Okay. Keep going round. Go round the other way. Sit down. At the very least, that should move a little more blood from your arse to your brain, and that's probably a good thing in terms of reflection. We won't get you to jump up and down because I haven't done your assessment of your mobility, and some of us, especially me at the moment, cannot jump up and down without crying. Okay, what we're going to do is do the other part of our narrative, and the other part is this bit about attachment and trauma, because when we talk about trauma, I would argue from a psychoanalytic perspective, the big trauma is often childhood trauma, the big trauma that gets missed. We talk about something called affluent trauma, because when the way in which we frame trauma, sometimes stupidly, is trauma happens in the sink estate in the house with a fridge in the front garden. And A, that's sometimes not true, and B, and fails to understand that trauma is about relationships. If the individual in that house has a parent who loves them, as a parent who's emotionally regulated, as a parent who can provide an empathic, continuous, safe relationship, who can ensure that child's exposure to stress is modulated, is graduated, that child's ability to handle stress is developed and nurtured and cherished and scaffolded, then the fridge in the front garden really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Because we see affluent trauma in houses where they have a new BMW in the front drive and the rest of it is missing and it matters. So when we think about trauma, we need to think about disrupted attachment relationships as potentially being the source of trauma, which is often neglected. Because people don't understand sometimes that their early childhood experiences are different from somebody else's early childhood experiences. We assume that everybody has the same experience we do, and we don't. Our experiences are profoundly different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of this and how it plays out. Because if we're lucky, we get that attunement, attachment, and love, and that provides the basis for emotional regulation, and that provides the basis in terms of empathy, and that provides the basis for pro-social behavior. It works. And in the vast majority of instances, this works. Or individuals are, over time, enabled to develop those skills in the absence of scaffolding. What we see in services are people for whom this process has failed. And these individuals struggle to demonstrate what's called, in the lingo, and psychodynamic psychotherapy has all positive emotionality. They can't adjust the response. I can adjust my emotional response. I might scream and shout when Glasgow are playing Edinburgh in rugby, and believe me, I am supporting Edinburgh rather than Glasgow. Although to my deep distress, my daughter and my wife both support Glasgow. They're both from Glasgow, I suppose, so I suppose there's a bit of an excuse there. I'm still not sure about it, but I'll give them that. So the ability here, the monitor and adjust duration of intense emotional reaction, think about that. And those of you familiar with the label of personality disorder, what does personality disorder look like? We now talk about emotional dysregulation. What does emotional dysregulation look like? It looks like exactly that empathic over-arousal. So we're giving somebody the label of a disorder, and in actual fact what we need to be talking about is their attachment history. We need to talk about somebody who's carrying a wound in terms of the early background history, in terms of dynamics. This individual's not disordered. This individual's doing the best with a brain that their early childhood experience gave them, and the fact they're still alive and breathing means they're doing okay. Some of the other coping stuff we might be anxious about, but they're here, they're standing in front of us. So what we see is if we get these inconsistent, insensitive, or unsafe responses, we get individuals who can't regulate their emotions. They can't switch their emotions up or down. They can't separate an emotion from their behaviour. The emotional behaviour one the same. They can't do the probabilistic reasoning that keeps you out of the shit most of the time. You can do an experiment in relation to this. And there's an interesting experiment, and again, my apologies, I'm going back to your alcohol issues, so let's stay with them, with your permission. How many of you have made, and we are not in any way going to ask you to share this, how many of you have made a bad decision under the influence of alcohol? Yes, okay. Why? Because alcohol is a neurotoxin. Alcohol has a profound effect on your brain, and what happens in terms of your alcohol consumption is the more you drink, basically in evolutionary terms, the newest parts of your brain start to go offline. So what starts to go offline, first of all, is your cortex, that bit of your brain that does probabilistic reasoning and also does empathy. What also starts to go offline, depending on your alcohol consumption, is your hippocampus, which remembers what happened the last time you did this. Yes? And the problem is, as your alcohol consumption goes up, in neurological terms, your decision-making gets delegated down the evolutionary tree to bits of your brain that weren't designed to think about how will I feel about this tomorrow. They just weren't. They don't have that capacity. You end up in a dynamic where we're back, in actual fact, in fight, flight, freeze, or fuck mode, frankly. Yeah, that's where we are. Yep. So you can blame your lizard brain and your amygdala for bad decisions, but it's not going to help you make better decisions. What you need to look at are, if you're using alcohol to manage stress, then you need to look at the source of that stress and the dynamic in terms of what you're trying to do, because you do not want your amygdala making your big decisions. You just don't. It's really not designed to do that. So infant attachment, I have a bee in my bonnet as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist trained with the Bowlby Institute, that most professionals are not sufficiently well trained and really well grounded in understanding attachment and what attachment does. Now, this is not an entire session in terms of attachment, and I understood you have some real expertise and consultancy to the organisation. But there's a whole series of key processes happen during attachment, all of which are critical. From claiming to attunement to effective attunement to impulse regulation, and it's a scaffold. And it's a process, and you don't get to jump steps. That's not how it works. All of those steps need to be worked through. So if I'm working with a 14-year-old in residential childcare and secure care who stabs somebody, and I'm working in terms of their developmental age and their emotional age, I need to understand where they are. Because often what we come across are kids who struggle with rage management in the way at 14 that a 3-year-old struggles with rage management. So I'm dealing with somebody who's chronologically 14 but emotionally is functioning at a 3-year-old level, and that's a dangerous combination both for that 14-year-old and for the other people in their community. So we need to understand where they are, and we need to think about how we create the conditions for the recovery. Now, when you talk about recovery for the adult, or we talk about recovery for the child, they're the same thing. Continuous connection. Connections are everything. Trauma happens in relationships, healing happens in relationships. We talk about safety, psychological safety, social safety, spiritual safety, which matters to individuals. We need to create a dynamic in which that individual experiences love, that they feel loved, that they feel held. And love is a tricky thing when we talk about professional relationships. We're often very wary of it, but there is a profound distinction between romantic love, which is probably a bad thing in this context, and actually human compassion. Because love is what people need to heal. Self-love is also significant, allowing that individual. But they also need the presence of an emotionally attuned adult, somebody who is conscious moment by moment to the lived emotional experience, to that other in that space, and aware of their dynamic. So we create the conditions for recovery when we get this right. Some of you will have seen this. If not, I'm going to show you it because it's beautiful. Okay. This is just a very sensitive trackpad. Just talk amongst yourselves while I do this. Don't make me feel self-conscious in any way at all. Stand in front of you. I think we've got a problem. I don't think this one's going to play for some reason. Yeah, I don't think it's working for some reason. Try double clicking something.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.